Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to this week's episode of the Next Level Human podcast. And this week, we're still doing health and fitness. That job is always an important one. It's the one I spend most of my time with. And we're going a deep dive into different metabolic topics with one of my favorite people in the industry. This is Robb Wolf. He is a former research biochemist and a 2 times New York Times, Wall Street Journal best-selling author. He wrote the book, The Paleo Solution. He also wrote the book, Wired to Eat. And he's got a new book out with his co-author, Diana Rogers. They recently released a book called The Sacred Cow, which really goes into sort of sustainable agriculture, why that is so good for the planet. And it's something that I have been educating myself on. And Robb is sort of always at the forefront of some of the most interesting conversations in our industry. He also happens to be one of the scientific agnostic type minds that is constantly evolving as the data evolves. This is one of the reasons I like him. He actually is someone who is very steeped in science. He actually, a lot of people don't know this, but he used to be a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism. And so that says a little bit about his well-versed nature in science and the scientific process. Anyway, without further ado, let's just get into the conversation. We talked about a lot of stuff, as well as his involvement with one of my new sponsors, LMNT, the electrolyte drink. So I was excited to get some of that background from him. But we go all over the place, cover lots of interesting topics in this discussion. I know that you'll enjoy it, and let's get on to the show. All right, everybody. I have someone who I have been an admirer of for some time, kind of silently. And we were just talking before we came on live that we've never actually formally met. I think it's the first time we met, but I've read all of his books. I've been a fan of his. Robb Wolf, welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. I'm excited to have you, my friend.
Hey, huge honor to be here. And like we said before recording, I would have swore that we had hung out at some point, but maybe not. Maybe I'm having some sort of lost 72 hours alien abduction thing or something. Yeah.
Well, it does speak to the fact that you and I have been doing this for a while, right? So we've both been in this for a while. And one of the things I love about you, and I'm excited about having you here, is, and I don't know how you feel about this, Robb, but I'd love to get your take on it. But in this industry, we have a lot of wonderful people and a lot of talking. And one of the things that happens with that is that all these opinions can sometimes get confused, and people don't know which way to go. You have always been, for me, one of the most reasoned, rational, more agnostic types in the industry, who always shows up with a very reasoned, rational approach. And I think it's because you have such a background in science, and that agnostic scientific mind usually makes people pretty reasoned and rational. But that's one of the things I've always loved about you. And it's one of the things that I love to talk about on the Next Level Human podcast. Even though I'm a naturopathic physician by training, I go, there's a ton of stuff on the naturopathic side that I don't love because it's not very evidence-based. And there's a lot of stuff on the conventional side I don't love because it's not necessarily evidence-based. And I try to have that agnostic mind. You seem to be a guy who has always shown up for us and the community in a way that is reasoned and rational and able to sort of go in a different direction and have nuanced conversations. And so I just want to say thank you for that, because it's been a really nice thing to have someone like you who's been sort of holding a standard.
Oh, well, thank you. And, I'll maybe throw a possible insight on that. We just moved to Kalispell, Montana, and our jiu-jitsu coach, Travis Davison, he built this gym 14 years ago. He started it as a purple belt. He's now like a third degree black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And my wife and I were commenting that he's just really a phenomenal coach. Like there's just a presence to him and everything. And to the degree that I think that I've got a little bit of a agnostic flair or meet people where they are, I think a lot of it was running a gym and then running kind of a clinical practice and interacting with people and really needing to actually get results. I certainly had a period of my career where there was a one size fits all approach, and then it started failing people. And I broke some people with using a tool that wasn't appropriate to them. And I think that over the course of time, if people really are running a robust kind of like clinical interface where they're really interacting with a lot of people and legitimately trying to help them, that it just forces a certain amount of circumspection around like, okay, we might think we know some stuff, but maybe we don't know quite as much as what we think we do, So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I mean, I know my first book, and then I can see in your first book, Paleo Solution, I could see going to Wired to Eat, was I saw that difference there. And same thing happened to me in sort of my first work. Having you on the show, we can go in so many different directions because you just have a wide knowledge of lots of different things. I do want to start with something that I've been crazy excited about. And this is something that I know you're involved in, and this is the product LMNT. And so I want to start here and get some of your insights here. So for those of you who don't know, LMNT is what I would describe one of these electrolyte powder beverages. It's kind of like Gatorade on steroids without any of the nonsense from my perspective. And it's one of the things that I would love to get your insight on, because I think this is something that is just not something that most people understand. When we think about hydration, I think you and I have probably heard over and over again in this field that most people are like, oh, you got to drink this amount of water and you have to do this and that. And they don't really understand hydration in a sense that hydration is this sort of combination of water and electrolytes and being able to get this into the system. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind beginning to educate us on this sort of topic and why you've wanted to get involved with LMNT and put your sort of brain power behind it.
Sure. And remind me to tell the story about Gatorade at the end of this. Like if I forget, we'll try to remember to kind of tag that in. But this is maybe a good illustration of beginner's mind. Like having a beginner's mind is really valuable for this stuff. I was trained as a biochemist. I'm fairly good at that. I know metabolism pretty well. I can do the little flow charts of the Krebs cycle and pentose phosphate pathway and how they all feed back on themselves. Like I'm reasonably good at that stuff. I liked it. And so I developed some aptitude with it. And I've always felt best eating kind of a low carb diet, or at least over the last 22 years, which is how long I've been tinkering with this. And I've tried little forays doing other things, but just for I don't know if it's genetics, epigenetics, a combo of things like bad luck, losing a bet, what have you. But I tend to do pretty well on kind of a post-ketogenic way of eating. But I had always struggled to do anything other than like kind of cardio or powerlifting type stuff. Once I got into any type of glycolytic type activity, CrossFit or jiu-jitsu or something like that, I really struggled. Like I really didn't have a low gear. And it shouldn't be surprising when you think about a ketogenic diet where you're not really ingesting a ton of carbohydrates. So the glycogen stores may be a little bit suboptimal and all that type of stuff. But I had bounced back and forth trying to figure out this way of like putting in pre or peri-workout carbs and then getting a little bit of a performance boost, but then I would kind of get back on the carb roller coaster after that. And I met a couple of guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villaseñor. They're the founders of this online platform called Keto Gains. And they have a couple of 100,000 people, mainly women, 35 to 60 years old, who are following like a classic 5x5 strength training program, an appropriate protein, low carb diet, like it's called ketogenes, but they're not focused so much on the keto side, just kind of like carbohydrate control, adequate protein, really getting appetite control from a low carb whole food diet. And man, the results that Tyler and Luis get with their clients is just jaw dropping. Like it's really amazing. And so I started kind of creeping these guys and hanging out with them. And one day asked them, hey, you guys seem to have pretty good performance in everything you're doing. Can you look at what I'm doing and just give me some feedback on this? And they're like, absolutely. So I detailed what I was up to, and they looked at everything and they were like, well, where's your sodium intake? And I was like, oh, I salt my food. And you could kind of see this look on their eyes. They're like, oh, we got a live one on the line, and because they had probably heard this by this point like 10,000 times, They're like, hey, we really think you probably need more electrolytes in general, but sodium in particular. And at this point, I didn't have good beginner's mind. I was kind of like, oh, I'm a biochemist. I know this stuff. I've got this buttoned up. I'm not afraid of sodium, And so I didn't listen to their advice, which is what a lot of people do when they're interacting with top of the food chain, world-class coaches. Of course, you ignore their initial advice. And I went probably a year of still hanging out with these guys and bitching and moaning about kind of, oh man, woe is me when I do jujitsu. I kind of motor along, but it's not that great. And I have these problems. And then one day they were like, no, man, really, like weigh and measure all your food, put it into like a chronometer app that tells you the protein, carbs, fat, but also gives you like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. Like it gives a very detailed analysis of everything that you have, including the electrolytes and micronutrients. They said you should be getting at least 5 grams of sodium a day and maybe double that potentially. And I was less than half of that, because if you're not eating a highly processed diet, then it's actually pretty challenging to get a significant amount of sodium in your diet. And this is one of the problems that I think that we're facing at large with the way that we look at sodium. People who eat a highly refined diet, we know that that's problematic. It's bad for cardiovascular disease. It increases diabetes risk potential, definitely feeds into hypertension, which is, I think, a lot of the concern around sodium intake. But it misses the fact that, is it the sodium or is it the processed food, or is it the fact that the sodium makes the processed food taste better, so you eat even more of it, which is kind of the whole premise of my second book, Wired to Eat. But damned if these guys weren't spot on. Like I fixed my sodium intake and I was like, guys, everything changed. Like I have this low gear, my sleep is better, my heart rate at any given work, output dropped like 5 to 10 beats per minute. And they're like, yep, that's the way it's supposed to work. And if somebody is put on a medically supervised ketogenic diet and they have a knowledgeable dietitian putting that program together, by hook or by crook, the individual will absolutely get a certain amount of magnesium, certain amount of potassium, but they will really focus on the sodium, because in a low insulin environment, our body tends to shed sodium very, very easily and shed water with it. And this can create this whole downward spiral where you start shedding potassium and you can end up with cardiac arrhythmias and disordered sleep and things that look like adrenal fatigue and thyroid dysregulation, all these things that we kind of attribute to low carb diets. And I was like, I asked these guys, are like 95% of the problems that we hang on low carb diets probably due to low sodium? And they're like, yeah, probably, because you don't really see these problems in a medically supervised ketogenic diet or low carb diet setting, or even medically supervised fasting. But these folks always make sure to get the electrolytes on point. And when you think about it, every nerve impulse, muscle contraction is driven by sodium potassium pumps. Like literally, that is kind of the currency of life, are these sodium potassium pumps. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I can't, other than maybe pH, I don't know that there's anything as tightly regulated as like electrolyte status. So pH is maybe like the most tightly regulated. Like the body will really spin out catastrophically if the pH goes too high or too low, and it's really vigorously maintained. But like blood sugar levels can be orders of magnitude different, and it may be good or bad, but it's not going to kill you outright. But if you change electrolyte status, like that sodium potassium level or pH, you can die really quickly. Like these are super tightly regulated kind of physiological parameters in our body. So I know I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit, but that's kind of the genesis of this whole thing. These guys showed me empirically, but basically, do this and look at what happens. And so we got all fired up about sharing this information with people. And we came up with this keto aid formula where you would do this much table salt and this much potassium chloride and a little bit of magnesium citrate and put some lemon juice in it and some stevia and mix it up. And we had like 500,000 downloads of this thing and people loved it. But then we started getting tagged on social media where people were like, hey, love the keto aid. But when I was going through TSA, they didn't like my 3 bags of white powder, that I was traveling with. And so it just occurred to us, there's an opportunity to do kind of a convenient stick pack type deal on this. And so we gave it a shot and got honest truth. The initial flavor, the citrus salt, we weren't really sure if, this electrolyte angle would work, but we formulated it as a possible margarita base. And so if this thing tanked as an electrolyte company, we were going to pivot and sell it as like a drink mix, and now we just kind of do both. Like
knock genius on wood, marketer to your
Well, I usually I'm like the worst one in the room with that stuff, but we really did identify a legit need. And then circling back around to the Gatorade, we had a friend of ours go to Florida State University, like the Gatorade museum and everything, and there was a display of the original Gatorade formulation, like when they first started doing it. When you look on that thing, it's 1 gram of sodium per serving. And now it's only about like 200 milligrams of sodium, if even that. So even as Gatorade has changed a lot over time, they've reduced the sodium and increased the sugars significantly. And I think that this is reflective of kind of the collective anxiety around sodium intake, and ironically not around the anxiety of like sugar intake. And sugar can definitely play an ergogenic role under certain circumstances, but for a lot of people, they really don't need to add more sugar to their diet. Like they really should be like paring that stuff out. But Gatorade really in the beginning was pretty smartly formulated. And if you go back even pre-Gatorade, the old football coach thing was like, have some salt tablets, have a jug of water, do the salt tablets, sip on water up to, satiety of your thirst mechanisms. And it was rare up until we were told to drink like 8-ounce glasses of water a day and to super hydrate in things like marathons and triathlons or what have you. There was a time when people didn't die from hyperhydration, from overhydrating themselves, diluting their electrolyte pool, and either being hospitalized or dying. And again, I know I'm kind of bouncing around there, but this was all the stuff that went into launching LMNT. There was a recognition that people really needed this stuff, and understanding that there's a real lack of understanding around the true electrolyte needs that people have, that sodium is arguably kind of the more important of the bunch, particularly when we're talking about a largely whole food, unprocessed diet. If somebody's eating Krispy Kremes and nachos, it's kind of a different story. Like we've got a whole other set of circumstances there. But people go to any type of like a Mediterranean, paleo, low carb type diet, and they pull the bulk of the processed foods out. They generally really benefit from ramping the sodium intake back up.
Yeah, it's such an interesting conversation because I have seen this in my clinical practice over and over again. I'm sure you have as well. People, especially you have someone going from a couch potato to sort of like this cross-fitting paleo person. And what ends up happening is obviously people like you and I would be like, this is a good move. They also, though, run into some problems because they're going from an extremely high sodium sort of take where the body is actually insulin, sort of the insulin is holding onto that sodium, to a very much lower sodium take where the insulin is, is releasing that sodium because there's not a lot of insulin around. Plus they're sweating like crazy. And then you start seeing lots of weird things show up. Sleep disturbances, sleep becomes fragmented and difficult. You start seeing twitching. You start seeing fatigue. You start seeing things that you're like, well, why am I seeing these things? And then you start adding in something like sodium and electrolytes. And for me, it was initially trying to figure this out on my own before I found your products. Like, oh, we need some magnesium. But sodium was always sort of last on my mind for whatever reason, partly because of what like you said, it slowly seeped in that, hey, we don't want too much sodium until you start digging into this and you essentially say, wait, that's sort of the major issue, which is why I got so excited about this. And actually, this will kind of dovetail into a discussion of metabolism. But one of the things that I've also seen, this goes into some of the stuff with DNA and, some of the researchers on, sort of the palatability of food, that perhaps, and I'm interested in your take on this, perhaps we have, our body is tasting things and trying to associate particular micronutrients with them. And so what we've also done in the modern era is we have, foods that can be savory without the amino acids, or foods that can be very sweet without the glucose. And so we're kind of disconnecting this. And we also have tastes that sort of regulate back to our hunger centers, sodium being one of the most important one of these. Yeah. And so one of the things I have seen, and I'm wondering if you're seeing this as well, is that this is actually cutting down cravings as well in some people. I'm wondering, are you seeing that? And what do you think the mechanism is there?
Yeah, it absolutely have seen that. And it's pretty interesting, particularly folks that are doing longer fasts, but not even that, just like trying to avoid eating between meals. We noticed that if they're on point with their electrolytes, particularly sodium, and this is where some things like miso soup or, like even a bouillon or something like that can be really powerful in helping people to stick to a lower calorie intake. But if you do a little bit of poking around in PubMed, there's this phenomenon called sodium appetite, which is basically this neuroregulation of appetite that seems to drive humans and other organisms towards the consumption of sodium. And in kind of a free living environment, usually that sodium is associated with kind of protein rich, nutrient dense foods. And, you can taste B vitamins. Like if you have a powder of B vitamins, it'll have a taste to it. If you eat some, magnesium citrate, it will have a taste to it. But the only nutrient that we really, of that kind of micronutrient class, that we have a specific taste receptor for is sodium. And it's kind of interesting. So it kind of dovetails a little bit into the protein leverage hypothesis and the optimum foraging strategy. And protein leverage hypothesis suggests that organisms eat to a protein minimum. And in nature, most protein-rich foods, whether you're talking about clover for a grazing animal or like meat or fish for an omnivore or a carnivore, protein-rich foods tend to be very, very nutritionally dense. You tend to get a lot of nutrition along the way with the food that you eat. And so if you eat to a protein minimum, the body kind of has this idea that so long as we hit these protein minimums, we're good. We get all the vitamins, minerals, antioxidants that we generally need. And that seems to be pretty true. And if we really look at some of the work that like Matt Lalonde or Marty Kendall have done in the nutrient density space, like a kind of a protein centric, minimally processed diet, whether it's higher carb or lower carb, tends to be very, very nutrient dense, provides a lot of nutrition relative to the calories. And again, whether we're on that higher carb side of things or lower carb side of things, what we've seen clinically is if folks aren't eating enough protein, they will inevitably tend to overeat either excess carbs or excess fat. And this is where I've seen these horror stories of people in the ketogenic diet space where they're terrified of protein. They're scared of mTOR and IGF-1, and they're eating 30 grams of protein a day and eating sticks of butter. And by God, they're gaining weight on it. They're gaining weight on a diet that's supposed to be impossible to gain weight on it. And it's kind of crazy. And it takes a lot of work to get people kind of drugged back to that kind of protein centric model. But once we get people there, just magic happens. And so, it's interesting how I think when you start understanding something better, like your messaging simplifies and whatnot. And I'm at this point now where I'm like, hey, just hit this protein minimum. Let's start there. Yep. And if you hit that, now let's figure out if you run a little bit better on carbs or a little bit better on fat, or maybe a little bit of a combination. And then maybe the last thing that we look at, maybe there's some immunogenic foods that we need to be aware of. Maybe you don't do well with gluten, or maybe dairy, or, maybe some other stuff. And it's so much less overwhelming, I think, for people, because it's kind of like, okay, yeah, I'll just make sure that breakfast, lunch, dinner, I get this palm and a half size whack of protein, and we do that. And then we can just kind of peel the onion instead of throwing all of paleo ancestral health at people right out of the gate. All of those things are cool. All of them can be valuable, and virtually no one needs all of that like right out of the gate. So that, yeah. But it does definitely circle back into the sodium, appetite, neuroregulation of appetite control mechanisms for sure.
Yeah, I love that. It's funny. I just did an interview with Herman Ponzer out of Duke. I don't know if you know his. He's the one that works on the whole idea of constrained energy metabolism.
Yep.
And he has done a lot with the Hadza Chamani tribes and other tribes. But he talks a lot about sort of this idea that half of their diet at least, and they're eating plenty of carbohydrates, but they're also really eating a pretty high protein diet. Like you, for a very long time, have been saying, if you're going to count something, count your protein. And I've also seen with that one of the things with ketogenic diets as well, this is just, sort of an aside, because I think people will be interested in it. One of the things I've seen with lots of people who have been successful on ketogenic diets is that they tend to avoid the sort of processed ketogenic foods that have different flavors in it, like stevia and things like this that can hijack sort of these appetite centers. But one of the things that I've always sort of done with ketogenic diets is looked essentially at two different things. Protein first, kind of bringing that back up if it's too low, because we know you typically keep moderate protein. It's not typically a high protein diet. People can get kicked right out of ketosis for that, but some people need that. And then sodium, and then reducing some of these highly palatable sort of non-nutritive things, even in the natural world, like xylitol or erythritol or stevia being a high force natural sort of sweetener. And so it's a really interesting sort of conversation to be having. And I am certainly in that place where I'm like, yes, prioritizing protein. And then perhaps number two, prioritizing sodium. As you said, they tend to come together sort of in the diet. And maybe we can make a difference with cravings and hunger and things like that. And obviously, if you're going to be able to get your results from a diet, you need to be able to stay on that particular diet. This makes us dovetail, though, into a whole other thing that you're also expert at and sort of helping people understand, which goes into sort of regenerative agriculture and this kind of idea, right? So if we're talking about protein now, many people would essentially say, and there's a whole conversation going on here, can we sustain the planet if we all move to a protein sort of based diet? And so there's this whole thing that starts to happen now. It's like, well, are we going to be moving towards cellular agriculture? Are we going to be moving more towards, sustainable agriculture? Obviously our soils are becoming depleted, and that is a serious issue. I'm wondering if you have anything to sort of say on this, because I think one of the first things that comes to mind for people who are sort of wanting to take care of themselves, and take care of the planet and other humans, which I would describe as a next level human. These things sort of come up. So they're just like, okay, well, what am I doing for my own personal health? What can I do and how can I eat for the health of the planet and to sustain this? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Obviously, you co-wrote a recent book called Sacred Cow with Diana Rogers, who I've had a pleasure of speaking with as well. Give us a little bit of your take on this. I think you're the perfect person to help us walk through some of these difficult conversations.
Oh man, I really wish it was somebody other than me, because it is such a. I did my first public talk around the potential of regenerative food systems, being kind of grass centric in 2006, and there was kind of it was organized at the California State University, Chico. And it was this food co-op that had they were going to start adding meat to their offerings. And there was some real pushback within the co-op members. And so there was, it was honestly kind of theater. Like the co-op had already decided they were going to do this, but they were kind of providing this public forum for people to thrash and flail and look like they were going to do something, but they'd already made the decision. But we had a group of people that like Cindy Daly and some other folks that are in the Department of Agriculture there. And I was invited to speak on this. And then we had some, kind of largely vegan centric folks that were talking about some of the challenges as they saw it. And this story has been 3 parts, and it's the health concerns of animal products in our food systems, the environmental concerns, and then the ethical concerns. And every interaction that I've had historically, like the health concern is something that we get hit with every day. Like every couple of weeks, there's a new study that says eating 1 egg a day increases your risk as much as a pack a day smoking habit and stuff like this. And it looks very scary. And it comes from Tufts or Harvard or, some august institution. But you need a little bit of a scientific background to get in and parse this stuff out. And then when you start digging into it, you're like, oh, this is really garbage research. They're taking a lot of stuff out of context. The foundations of these papers are asking people to recall what they've eaten, sometimes as much as 12 years in the past. And I mean, it's just kind of garbage research, but it's a lot to unpack that. And then you have the ethical consideration, which is, is it ethically okay for a human being to take the life of another organism to eat it? And particularly people will say, well, we can raise all these grains, we can do all this stuff, we could grow meat in a lab, so where do the ethics lie on this? But it gets kind of interesting when you start scratching around on the human nutrition side. And you look at early life and late life parameters of a low animal protein intake diet, it's virtually impossible to grow a human child, from in utero and then grow them up to adulthood and do that in a way that they don't suffer pretty significant nutrient deficiencies without some sort of animal product input. Like it's not super common, but occasionally you see these examples of vegan parents feeding their kids a vegan diet and the child ends up very sick or dying, even the breast milk of the mother being so nutrient deficient that it can't support the child's life. So the ethical story starts taking on some interesting characteristics when you look at like early life considerations. Like, can you grow a human being without animal products? And people will push back and say, well, you can use these supplements and do this and do that. And maybe you can, maybe you can't. It's not entirely clear if you can. And that's going to be a really big lift in marginalized populations. Developing countries, poorer folks, they don't have the ability to go into a Walgreens around the corner and get DHA extracted from algae and a highly bioavailable, low gut irritating iron source, and on and on and on. And then you kind of circle around to the environmental side, which is, I think, a lot of where we're getting the main messaging now. We're told that animal husbandry is contributing, some of the numbers kicked around it, that it contributes as much as 78% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is, really scary at face value. And then you discover that 78% is completely inaccurate and that the real number was closer to 3%. But once these things are said, it's kind of like peeing in a pool. It's just out in the internet. And like that 78% number has been picked up by news organizations, social media, even some scientific papers have misattributed this number. So it's a massive, gnarly problem to unpack. And suggesting that there's anything that we need to discuss around this further, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but there's this thing called cancel culture going around, where if you pop your head up and say something that isn't of the orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy can kind of change day to day, although there's kind of some definitely some lane lines there, but suggesting that animal husbandry, one, may not be remotely the contributor to greenhouse gases that it's portrayed, and that two, the fact it's part of a biogenic process, that it's part of life, that it doesn't really matter in this climate change discussion. Like you are facing deplatforming, any business stuff you're associated with getting attacked. And so it's we did this book and this film. We started it in earnest about 5 years ago, and then the book released right at the height of COVID, kind of June of 2020. And I'm glad we did it on the one hand, and then I've been terrified that we did it on the other, because I'm not really sure what type of bullseye it's painted on my back and my family and all the rest of that stuff. But I was listening to the Dark Horse podcast this morning, and that has Brett and Heather Weinstein. They're both evolutionary biologists. It's I think one of the most important podcasts that are available right now. And it was interesting. They weren't talking about this specifically, and I don't want to mischaracterize or take what they said out of context, but they were talking about a news article that was saying that the Amazon rainforest was actually contributing to climate change. Mm-hmm. This was the headline. And they were like, what the hell is this thing talking about? And when you dug into it, what was revealed was that it was deforestation of the Amazon rainforest that was contributing to climate change, because you're burning all this biomass. And so this carbon is getting, released into the atmosphere. This is a concerning feature, but they went on to mention this thing, which I've struggled. It's funny. Kids really understand this at kind of an intuitive level, and adults really have struggled with it, or maybe I'm poor at articulating it or what have you. But if you think about just a plant, like we don't even need to think about the Amazon rainforest, but a plant goes through this process of photosynthesis where it pulls carbon dioxide out of the air, and it uses the energy from the sun to link carbon molecules together, and it creates carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and all kinds of different stuff. And if that gets eaten, it will release greenhouse gases, because if we eat some carbohydrate, we will pull it into our body. And then when we do some exercise of general metabolism, the carbohydrate gets broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and it gets released back into the environment. If we take that stuff and stick it in the rumen of an animal like a cow, it will release greenhouse gases. It could be methane, it could be carbon dioxide, but it's that same process. But or if this stuff gets cut up and put into a compost pile, it will release greenhouse gases ultimately. The carbon dioxide will ultimately either become part of the soil, which is actually kind of cool. It's some carbon sequestration opportunity there, or it'll get released into the atmosphere. But these biogenic sources of carbon are a cycle. And this is something that really escapes people. So long as life is going on, it will be a greenhouse gas emitter, but it is also a greenhouse gas sequesterer. And this is the thing that really gets lost in this whole massive story. And where it has gotten really dangerous, like a good 6 years ago, there was a piece that appeared in physics.org, a website kind of devoted to physics and engineering and whatnot, and was talking about how it's been recently discovered that shellfish, different types of shellfish in the ocean floor, produce absolutely prodigious amounts of methane. And there was a suggestion that maybe we should eradicate shellfish to reduce the methane production. And then there was a similar article that was talking about termites produce huge amounts of methane. Maybe we should get rid of termites. And then there was even a piece that was talking about the Green Party in Sweden, that they were putting forward some legislation that they should eradicate or dramatically reduce the moose population in Sweden, because the moose eat lichen and produce greenhouse gases via, cellulosic fermentation. And this is insanity. What people are suggesting is eradicating life on Earth to protect life on Earth. And this distinction between biogenic sources of greenhouse gases and the fact that this is part of a dynamic equilibrium, like in some situations, more carbon will get sequestered into the soil, like in the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico. There's a rancher and several ranchers down there now that we highlighted in our Sacred Cow film. He's reversed over 1 million acres of desertified area and converted it into grasslands. This grassland is now a major greenhouse gas emitter. It releases carbon dioxide. It releases methane. but it sequesters more than it releases. But it is a releaser. But it's reversing, it's converting land that is not usable for anything as far as food production, and it's reversing that. And desertification is one of the most challenging things that we face, because if our farmland all desertifies, we're not growing anything. And this is kind of the inevitable process that goes forward in these areas. And ironically, one of the only tools that we appear to have to mitigate this process is some amount of animal interaction, and typically grazing animals. Chickens don't work, pork doesn't really work, but grazing animals, moose, bison, cows, deer, kangaroos, like all of these things can really play a remarkable role in mitigating this other piece of climate change, which is desertification. So I don't know if I answered that question, but
I love it, man. Yeah, I think you did. I love it. And here's the interesting thing. What comes to mind, right, is like we hear a lot of people talking about ecosystems, and we've destroyed the ecosystems. And in a sense, yes, we have. But what you're talking about is we also have the opportunity with this greater understanding of rebuilding ecosystems. And it may be our only way of doing this. We certainly can't take a mechanistic approach and sort of just say we have to wipe out certain things without understanding. It's just like, to me, cutting out, one of your organs or something and not really understanding what it is. Like before, it's like, oh, we don't need the spleen, let's take it out. Then you find out, oh, the spleen's doing a lot of good stuff.
It's pretty important. Yeah,
it's
you would like
important
to keep that.
Yeah, let's get rid of the appendix. Then we find out, oh, the appendix is, something that's super important for your immune system, things like that. I do think you articulated that incredibly well, because one of the things I think, and again, this is what I appreciate about your mind in general, what we need people is to look at things in a holistic way and to realize and say, wait a second here, let's understand this a little better. And let's also understand we don't necessarily live in that sort of old world. And so we are going to have to, as humans, sort of duplicate some of these systems that may not be working in their natural form as they once were. I've learned a lot about this from you and Diana, and sort of soil regeneration. For me, I was more on the cellular agriculture sort of bandwagon.
Mm-hmm.
I still am. I'm sort of like, it's probably going to be a little bit of both to feed the population, but now I'm leaning more towards, due to this education, this idea of regenerative agriculture. I think it's very important. I do think people who listen to this podcast, who are people like you and I, they're basically people who are very concerned with their own health and also concerned about being good humans and, for others and for the environment. It's a hugely important piece here. Now, I know you have limited time here, so I want to basically go through one more question that I always like to ask. When I have someone of your sort of breadth of knowledge here, one of the questions that I want is just to ask you, where are you in the place? I'm sure you're like this. I'm like this. I'm always like, this is the thing I'm researching. This is the thing I'm most excited about. This is the new insight I have come to understand that I would like to pass on. And it sort of goes through cycles with creators and intellectuals, right? It's like, you're sort of working on a particular project. Where are you now? And what is the thing that you're just like, Jade, here's one thing that, sort of I am really concerned about, or wanting to know about, or my next piece of work, or my new current insight. Let us know if there's anything like that for you right now that we want to be keeping an eye on.
Oh, cool. That's a great question. Definitely still beating the drum on this regenerative ag scene. I'm trying to do it in a way that I don't get canceled. I am trying to keep relevant in here. And I try to, one thing I've learned is couching things as a question is much more safe than making an even modestly emphatic statement. So asking lots of questions has kind of deflected, I think, some of the vitriol around that. At the beginning of 2020, I had a talk that was titled and is titled "Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard?" And so within it, spans from the vegan scene to the fasting and low carb scene, this sense that protein intake is really injurious, that it's going to shorten your lifespan, that it upregulates mTOR, insulin-like growth factors, and it's going to give everybody cancer and everybody neurodegenerative disease, and we're all going to die. Well, there's a news flash. We're all going to die. Like that, nobody's getting out alive. And I think that this is actually some of the problem on the vegan side of this, is a complete disconnect from the reality of life and death within our existence. But that's kind of a a totally separate topic for another day. But I see people doing things in an effort to, in I think their mind, minimize the risk of cancer, minimize the risk of neurodegenerative disease. And I see them making kind of a Faustian bargain in which they are taking a potentiality and trading up their risk profile for something that is a known problem. Now, all of us have some sort of a genetic and epigenetic risk profile associated with cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, various types of cancer and whatnot. None of it is one for virtually any of us. Some people have some very high risk profiles for certain things. But it's some fractional part of one with all this stuff. But with a process called sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass, it is a guarantee. Once you get past 30, if you're not strength training, there is a very predictable, decline in muscle mass, in power production, and the loss of fast twitch motor units. And what's interesting is that when you really look at effective aging, it is those people who maintain the metabolic health, the metabolic flexibility, the dietary practices, and the movement practices that forestall the sarcopenic process, the loss of muscle mass, the loss of these fast twitch motor units. They age really, really well. They don't live forever. They die eventually, but it's crystal clear that people who strength train, eat adequate protein, they can have in their 90s the physicality of somebody who is relatively sedentary in their 50s. So it's like getting a doubling of your effective health span. And so this is something that I've been beating some drums around, because I see people doing super long fasting, very low protein diets. And my crowd is more kind of the low carb ketogenic kind of scene. And I don't want this to come off as disparaging, but I see people in that scene, and when I see them, their sense of vigor and physicality, I can't tell if they are like a raw vegan. Like, they look nutrient deficient. They've got dark circles under their eyes. They look like if their car slid off of an icy road, that they would not be strong enough to haul themselves back up a snowy, cold embankment and hike themselves to safety. Like, they are not resilient individuals. And so I've really been beating this drum that I think that the bulk of the literature around calorie restriction, fasting, and all of the claims that suggest that it's going to be this like longevity boon are largely due to the fact that when you look at the circumstances that these calorie restricted diets are introduced in animals, it's mainly just protecting the animals from a really poor lab-based diet. And it's doing absolutely nothing more than that. And if we understand anything, we know that eating less bad food is better than eating more bad food.
Yeah.
And even on that mTOR side, chronically overeating protein, having chronically elevated insulin levels. Yes, that's a problem without a doubt. But eating 2 or 3 meals a day, punctuated activation of mTOR and IGF-1, doing some resistance training, doing a little bit of sprint interval training, turning things on and off. People have kind of taken this aging story and reduced it to an on-off switch. And they've sided with the notion that it's better to have all of this stuff turned off entirely versus turned on. You think about the piano keys on a standard piano, and I think it's 88 keys. And there's literally an infinite amount of music that one could create with 88 keys and the various timing and combinations. And nobody would say that music would be better if everything was just turned all on or all off. And then you think about the human genome, and we have about 23,000 genes. And people are suggesting that we should be in this mode where it's just all on or all off. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. So I've really been beating some drums around this notion that we want intermittency. You don't want to overeat all the time, but you also don't want to undereat all the time. Like there's a case for some feast and some case for some famine. And there's definitely a strong case to be made that most people, if they are debating, should I add, I'm doing 1 48-hour fast a month right now. Should I bump that up to 72 hours? I would ask, are you doing 3 or 4 days of strength training per week already? And if you're not, I would side on the add an additional day of strength training per week versus adding an additional day of fasting per month, because and then also get out in the sun as much as you can without, getting burned, have meaningful social interactions, do those other things that we know are really well correlated with a good health span, because those things are really known. Like, we understand that a solid strength training program, adequate protein intake, all of that feeds into a guaranteed better return on investment from the perspective of like a health span. It doesn't mean that you won't get cancer, but we also know that people who get cancer, who strength train, who eat healthfully, beat cancer better, and there is absolutely no guarantee that starving yourself and being sarcopenic at a too young age is going to prevent cancer. That is entirely speculative. So that's been the stuff that I've been noodling on and kind of beating the drum. And there are some really smart people that are more on that protein restriction side, the calorie restriction, the fasting side of this thing. People who are much smarter than I am, but I really think that they have, I could be wrong. So as one sideline, I could be completely full of shit, and that what they're recommending is actually the way to a healthier, happier, better, longer life. But it's also possible, I think, those people have gotten too far out in the mechanistic weeds, and they need to take a step back and look at this kind of more holistic picture, some strength training, some sun, some community, some novel activity, appropriate protein intake. Everything that I understand about effective aging and kind of health in general is supported by doing that. And I see people get into sketchy areas with too much of the fasting, too much of the protein restriction and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm so on board with you. And one of the things I hope everyone listening to Robb speak is that one of the things I've always seen about you being engaged with your work is you are not a biased individual. I mean, you're human, so you're biased. We're all biased, but in a sense, you always seem to check your bias. And I do think this is an agnostic sort of scientific mind. I try to do the same. Part of what I see with too many people is they will let their opinions become, sort of their identity. And I think that's what happens. They start heading in sort of a different direction. And you're right, could be wrong, but the bottom line is that just the fact that you're saying that and the way that you're sort of articulating this in a very holistic, unbiased way, I think is the way we all should be thinking. That way we are better able to correct ourselves when the correction comes, because we're all going to find plenty of things to be wrong about. I mean, we've seen this with the whole COVID sort of thing. Yep. It's just gone off the rails in so many different directions. And it's the people who have been the most sort of balanced and checking their biases that I've been most impressed by. And certainly that's been the case with you, for me, following you throughout your career. So I know you have, a busy day, my friend. I am incredibly grateful to have your mind. Where do people find you? Where are you spending most of your time? I know you do a ton on social media, YouTube, but where would you suggest they really go to find most of your work?
I'm doing a lot of writing for LMNT, so drinkelement.com, and then our blog there. I'm trying to produce a lot of material there. And then probably the podcast I do with my wife, the Healthy Rebellion podcast. Just
Such a
check
good
that
podcast.
out. Oh, thank you. We have a ton of fun doing it. It's really a ton of fun. And those are kind of the main places that I'm hanging out these days.
Yeah. Robb, thank you so much for your work, man. I mean, honestly, the industry is so much better to have you, brother. So appreciative of you. So keep it up, and hopefully me and you will be able to connect in person sometime soon, my friend.
Awesome. NorCal margaritas are on me when we do it.
I got you. Same, man. Same when you come to Asheville, brother.
Awesome.
Be well, my friend.